There comes a moment in the inner life when a seeker realizes that spiritual growth is not achieved by adding something new, but by releasing something old. This realization is the doorway to understanding what it truly means to die to self. It is not an act of sacrifice imposed from outside, nor a denial of life's joys, but a gentle awakening to what has never been real in the first place. The self that must die is not your true being, but the imagined identity built on fear, control, and separation. Most of human struggle is born from the belief that life depends upon personal strength, personal wisdom, and personal effort. This belief creates tension, anxiety, and endless striving. When one begins to understand dying to self, this heavy burden starts to lift. The constant need to defend, prove, or improve oneself quietly fades. In its place comes a stillness that reveals life as something already complete, already sustained by a higher intelligence. Dying to self means relinquishing the belief that you are the door of your life. It is the surrender of the inner voice that says, "I must make things happen," or "I alone am responsible for my success and safety." As this voice is released, a deeper awareness emerges, one that recognizes a divine order unfolding. Notice, trust replaces effort, guidance replaces anxiety. Life begins to move with a rhythm that feels natural rather than forced. This inner surrender does not make a person passive or weak. On the contrary, it brings a strength that does not fluctuate with circumstances. When the personal self steps aside, clarity appears. Decisions are no longer driven by fear or desire, but arise from quiet discernment. Relationships soften, because there is no longer a need to control outcomes or seek validation. Compassion flows effortlessly as the sense of separation dissolves. To die to self is to allow the false identity to fall away so that true being may be revealed. It is the end of inner conflict and the beginning of spiritual freedom. What remains is a peaceful awareness anchored in trust, guided by wisdom, and sustained by a presence that has always been there. In this understanding, life is no longer a struggle to survive, but a sacred unfolding to be witnessed, trusted, and lived in quiet joy. Dying to self is often misunderstood as a form of physical denial or the rejection of one's human life. But in its true spiritual sense, it has nothing to do with loss, punishment, or self-destruction. It is the surrender of the false center of identity known as the personal ego, the mental construct that believes it exists apart from divine source. This ego is built from accumulated beliefs, fears, memories, ambitions, and labels that have been accepted over time and mistaken for true selfhood. When this false identity governs life, every experience is filtered through fear of lack, fear of failure, fear of rejection, and fear of loss. Dying to self begins when one recognizes that this ego-based identity is not the real I, but merely a collection of learned responses and conditioned thinking. The ego thrives on control and survival. It constantly seeks to protect itself by planning, worrying, comparing, and judging. It claims ownership of actions by saying, "I did this," or "I failed," and it measures worth through outcomes and appearances. To die to self is to gently release this claim of personal authorship and allow a higher intelligence to be acknowledged as the true source of life, action, and supply. This surrender does not mean becoming empty or inactive. It means letting go of the belief that personal will is the power behind existence. As this belief loosens, a subtle but profound shift occurs within consciousness. Instead of striving to become spiritual, one begins to notice that spiritual awareness has always been present beneath the noise of egoic thought. The sense of me as a separate entity struggling to survive starts to fade, replaced by a quiet recognition of being sustained moment by something greater than human effort. This is not an emotional experience, but a deep inner knowing. Fear begins to lose its authority because it no longer has a false self to attach itself to. When there is no rigid personal identity to defend, criticism no longer wounds in the same way, and success no longer inflates the sense of self. Dying to self is therefore an awakening rather than a loss. Nothing real is removed, only what was never true. What dissolves is the illusion of separation, the belief that life is a personal project managed by limited human ability. What remains is clarity, peace, and an effortless sense of being aligned with a greater order. In this surrender, life is no longer carried as a burden, but experienced as a flow, directed by wisdom that does not originate in personal thought, but expresses itself naturally through it. True freedom begins when personal will yields to divine guidance, because personal will is rooted in limitation, while divine guidance flows from infinite intelligence. The personal will is shaped by past experiences, cultural conditioning, fears and desires, all of which narrow perception and distort decision-making. It attempts to control life by predicting outcomes, manipulating circumstances, and forcing solutions that appear logical to the human mind. This effort often produces exhaustion rather than peace, because the personal will is constantly reacting to uncertainty and change. As long as life is directed from this level, freedom remains elusive, replaced by the pressure to make the right choices and the fear of making the wrong ones. Yielding personal will does not mean abandoning responsibility or becoming indifferent to life's events. It is an inner shift in authority, where one recognizes that human reasoning alone is not the source of wisdom. In this yielding, the individual no longer insists on a predetermined outcome, but becomes receptive to a higher order unfolding through each moment. This receptivity opens awareness beyond the narrow framework of personal preference. Instead of asking how to make life conform to expectation, consciousness begins to listen for direction arising from within, not as a voice, but as clarity, peace, and an intuitive sense of right movement. When personal will steps aside, resistance dissolves. Much of human suffering comes from opposing what is already taking place, mentally arguing with circumstances, or attempting to reshape reality through force. Divine guidance operates without strain, revealing itself through ease rather than struggle. Actions taken from this guidance carry a quality of harmony, even when challenges are present. There is less inner conflict because choices are no longer weighed down by fear of loss or desire for control. One acts, yet without the tension of personal ownership over results. This surrender brings a surprising sense of freedom because it releases the individual from the burden of self-direction. Life no longer feels like a series of obstacles to overcome, but like a path that unfolds step by step. Trust replaces anxiety, not as blind faith, but as a natural response to recognizing a wisdom that consistently proves itself through alignment and balance. The mind becomes quieter, not because thoughts disappear, but because they no longer dominate awareness. As personal will yields, identity shifts. The sense of being a separate planner and controller fades, replaced by the awareness of being an instrument through which life expresses itself. This does not diminish individuality, it refines it. Expression becomes more authentic, less driven by comparison or ambition. Freedom is experienced not as the ability to impose one's will, but as the peace of moving in harmony with a guidance that is steady, intelligent, and deeply sustaining, allowing life to be lived with confidence rather than constant effort. Fear and struggle arise from the belief that life is managed by a separate, vulnerable self that must constantly protect itself from uncertainty. This belief creates a sense of isolation in which every challenge appears personal and every outcome feels threatening. When identity is rooted in this false center, fear becomes a constant companion, shaping thoughts, decisions, and reactions. Struggle follows naturally, because the mind believes it must fight against circumstances to survive. The moment one begins to release the false sense of self, fear starts to loosen its grip, not through effort, but through understanding. The false self is sustained by identification with thoughts, emotions, and external conditions. It claims ownership over success and failure and defines itself through roles, possessions, and achievements. When these temporary elements are mistaken for identity, their instability produces anxiety. Letting go of the false sense of self means recognizing that thoughts and emotions are experiences, not the source of being. As this recognition deepens, Awareness shifts from the changing surface of life to the quiet presence beneath it. This presence is not affected by loss, uncertainty, or change, and fear finds no foundation there. As fear diminishes, struggle also fades. Struggle is the mental resistance to what is occurring, the inner argument that insists life should be different from what it is in the present moment. This resistance drains energy and clouds perception. When the false self releases its demand to control outcomes, resistance dissolves. Life is no longer approached as an enemy to be conquered, but as a movement to be understood. Challenges may still arise, but they are met with clarity rather than panic, and action flows from insight instead of reaction. The dissolution of fear does not result in passivity or indifference. Instead, it brings a heightened awareness that allows appropriate action to arise naturally. Without fear distorting perception, responses become more intelligent and effective. The mind no longer jumps to conclusions or anticipates disaster. It remains open, observant, and receptive. This openness allows solutions to appear that were previously hidden by anxiety and self-centered thinking. When the false sense of self is released, there is a profound shift in how life is experienced. Events are no longer interpreted as personal attacks or tests of worth. There is a growing sense of trust in the underlying order of existence. This trust does not depend on favorable circumstances. It arises from the recognition that one's true being is not at risk. Fear cannot survive where there is no imagined self to defend, and struggle cannot continue where resistance has been replaced by acceptance. What remains is a steady peace, a quiet strength that moves through life without the need for constant vigilance, allowing each moment to unfold without the weight of fear-driven effort. Inner peace emerges through spiritual awareness because true peace is not the absence of external challenges, but the recognition of an unchanging presence within. Most people seek peace through circumstances, wealth, relationships, status, or achievements, yet these external conditions are fleeting and unreliable. Spiritual awareness shifts the focus inward, revealing that peace exists independent of life's ups and downs. It arises when consciousness recognizes itself as rooted in something eternal, unshaken by events, and untouched by the turbulence of the personal mind. This awareness is not cultivated by effort or force. It is uncovered when attention turns from transient appearances to the enduring truth beneath them. The personal self, conditioned to identify with thought and emotion, creates a sense of restlessness and conflict. It reacts to every disappointment, desire, and expectation, generating inner turbulence. When spiritual awareness is cultivated, the mind begins to observe without attachment, realizing that these fluctuations are temporary and not the essence of being. The deeper self or presence remains unchanged, providing a stable foundation upon which all experiences can be viewed with clarity and equanimity. This observation is not a passive withdrawal from life, but an active recognition of the difference between the impermanent and the eternal. As awareness deepens, the need to manipulate or control outcomes diminishes. Peace is no longer dependent on shaping circumstances to suit personal desires. Instead, it arises naturally from trust in a higher order, from the understanding that life unfolds according to principles beyond the limited personal perspective. The mind that once oscillated between worry, regret, and anticipation finds rest in the realization that guidance and wisdom are available when one turns inward to align with them. Decisions and actions flow from this awareness rather than from fear or attachment, producing a sense of harmony in every endeavor. Spiritual awareness also transforms relationships and interactions. When the inner foundation is steady, reactions are less impulsive and judgments are softened. Conflicts lose their intensity because they are not perceived as threats to personal survival. Compassion and patience naturally arise because the observer recognizes the same impermanent and conditioned nature in others that once caused struggle within. This awareness generates a profound ease, a quiet joy that is not contingent on external validation or outcomes. Inner peace, therefore, is the natural fruit of spiritual awareness. It is a state that cannot be forced, only realized. As the mind releases its attachment to the illusory control of personal selfhood, it emerges when one recognizes the eternal presence within, when thought no longer dominates perception, and when trust replaces fear. In this awareness, life is experienced with calm clarity, and every moment carries a quiet assurance that all is guided and sustained beyond the fluctuations of the personal mind. Letting go of self-centered thinking is one of the most profound steps towards spiritual awakening, because the personal self constantly interprets life through the lens of desire, fear, and judgment. Self-centered thinking creates the illusion that happiness, fulfillment, and success depend upon personal effort, recognition, or control over circumstances. This mindset leads to endless striving, disappointment, and conflict both internally and externally. When one truly begins to release this pattern, a shift occurs. Life is no longer measured by what can be acquired, defended, or achieved, but by a deeper awareness of truth, presence, and connection. Letting go does not mean inaction or passivity. It means releasing the inner need to dominate, manipulate, or impose personal preference on life. The personal self thrives on comparison and competition, constantly evaluating experiences as favorable or unfavorable, right or wrong. It clings to outcomes that reinforce its sense of identity and rejects those that challenge it. This attachment generates tension and dissatisfaction because life is inherently unpredictable and cannot be molded entirely to fit personal desires. When self-centered thinking is relinquished, the mind begins to see that these judgments are not the measure of reality, but simply the constructs of an ego attempting to survive. Awareness expands beyond personal preference, allowing a more objective perception of life to emerge, one that is rooted in presence rather than reaction. Releasing self-centered thought also opens the heart to a greater compassion and understanding. When attention is no longer fixed on personal gain or avoidance of discomfort, one naturally becomes more attuned to the needs, struggles, and experiences of others. This shift creates harmony in relationships as interactions are no longer filtered through fear, judgment, or expectation. Decisions arise from clarity rather than impulse, and actions are guided by discernment instead of desire. Life begins to flow more smoothly because resistance, the internal struggle to make life conform to self-centered expectations, gradually diminishes. Letting go also aligns consciousness with a higher order, allowing truth and wisdom to govern life rather than egoic interpretation. As the grip of self-centered thinking loosens, intuition, insight, and inner guidance become more accessible. Choices are made not to serve personal ambition but to respond to what is needed in each moment. This does not negate individuality or initiative. Rather, it refines them. Expression becomes authentic because it is no longer overshadowed by the compulsion to prove, control, or manipulate outcomes. Ultimately, letting go of self-centered thinking transforms the experience of life. The mind is freed from the constant tension of defending or enhancing the personal self, and inner space opens for peace, clarity, and joy. Life is no longer a battlefield of desires and fears, but a harmonious unfolding guided by wisdom beyond the personal perspective, allowing consciousness to operate from truth rather than illusion, and bringing a sense of freedom and alignment that was previously unattainable while the ego remained in control. Spiritual rebirth occurs when identity shifts from the personal to the divine, marking the culmination of the journey inward and the emergence of true consciousness. This rebirth is not a physical transformation or a change in social role, but a profound shift in awareness in which the self no longer defines itself by thoughts, emotions, or external circumstances. The old identity, rooted in fear, ambition, and separation, gradually dissolves as one recognizes that life is not something to be controlled or managed, but something to be experienced as an expression of a higher intelligence. In this recognition, the sense of limitation inherent in the personal self begins to disappear, and a new sense of freedom and clarity emerges. The process of spiritual rebirth begins when the mind surrenders the belief that personal effort alone determines outcomes. The personal self has long been conditioned to think that survival, happiness, and success depend upon its careful planning and tireless striving. This belief fuels anxiety, struggle, and the illusion of separation. When the shift occurs, consciousness recognizes that life flows through a universal presence that is always guiding, sustaining, and expressing itself through every moment. The individual ceases to see life as a battlefield of personal effort and instead begins to witness the natural unfolding of events with trust and ease. As identity moves from the personal to the divine, the inner life becomes increasingly characterized by peace, clarity, and joy. Decisions are no longer made solely from the perspective of self-interest, but arise from a deeper awareness that perceives the interconnectedness of all things. Action flows naturally, guided by insight rather than fear or attachment. The qualities that were once pursued externally, such as security, acceptance, and recognition, are now experienced internally because the mind is aligned with its true source. Life is no longer a struggle to achieve or protect, but an expression of an intelligence that has always been present. This rebirth also transforms relationships and interactions. When one no longer identifies with the limited self, there is less need to compete, compare, or control. Compassion, patience, and understanding naturally arise because the perception of separation diminishes. One begins to see others not as threats or obstacles, but as fellow expressions of the same universal presence. The ego's constant demands for validation and recognition lose their hold, and a deep sense of inner satisfaction replaces the previous dependency on external approval. Spiritual rebirth is ultimately a return to truth. It is the realization that the personal self was never the center of being, but merely a temporary appearance within a larger, eternal consciousness. This shift brings freedom from fear, struggle, and limitation, revealing life as a harmonious unfolding. Consciousness now operates from a place of alignment, allowing the divine presence to express itself fully through thought, word, and action, and creating a life imbued with peace, joy, and clarity that transcends all previous experience. In conclusion, truly understanding what it means to die to self is the gateway to a life of freedom, peace, and spiritual fulfillment. Each step, surrendering the ego, yielding personal will to divine guidance, releasing fear and struggle, cultivating inner awareness, letting go of self-centered thinking, and experiencing spiritual rebirth reveals a deeper truth that our true identity is not the limited personal self, but the eternal presence within. As this realization unfolds, life transforms from a constant struggle for control and recognition into a harmonious flow guided by wisdom, love, and trust. Fear loses its grip, effort is replaced by ease, and every moment becomes an opportunity to live from the truth of being. To die to self is not to lose life, but to awaken to the fullness of it, discovering that the divine presence has always been sustaining, guiding, and expressing itself through you. This understanding allows one to live with clarity, compassion, and joy, aligned with the eternal source of life itself.